Since joining FERC, Mr. Chatterjee has focused his efforts on several strategic initiatives, including streamlining and improving FERC's liquefied natural gas or LNG export terminal application review and approval process, ensuring that new technologies as electric storage can compete freely in energy markets, reforming the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, securing the nation's energy infrastructure from physical and cyber threats, and bolstering grid reliability and resilience. And with that, Commissioner Chatterjee, thank you so much, and please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It is truly an honor to be your keynote speaker today. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this critically important exchange of ideas. I've always appreciated AEI's support for free enterprise and thoughtful market-based solutions. Before I start, I have to make some legal disclaimers. The views I express here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the Commission or my fellow commissioners. As you also may be aware, the Commission's ex parte rules prevent me from discussing any contested proceedings that are currently pending before us. With that, I'd like to turn to the issues I'd like to speak about today. I have had the opportunity to be at the agency, both as chairman and commissioner, at a pivotal time when we are facing some of the most complex regulatory issues we've ever had to tackle. Through it all, my regulatory philosophy has been to prioritize reliability, provide stakeholders with as much certainty and stability as possible, break down barriers to entry, and leverage the power of competition through our wholesale markets. In my view, continuing to advance these core principles will ensure that consumers have access to the reliable, affordable, and clean energy they demand. The energy landscape is evolving at a pace we've never seen before. As we move towards a cleaner generation mix, something I wholeheartedly support, we cannot lose sight of the Commission's core mission, which is ensuring reliable energy at just and reasonable rates. U.S. electricity prices are historically low, both because natural gas-fired power plants are able to access the abundant, affordable supply of natural gas we are blessed to have in our country, and because zero marginal cost resources like wind and solar are increasing their participation in our markets every day. Indeed, renewables are already playing a significant role in the nation's generation mix, and the share of renewables is only expected to grow. That's a good thing, but it's not without challenges. First, as we all know, many of the larger, more efficient renewable resources tend to be far from load centers. So we're going to need to build a substantial amount of transmission infrastructure to connect supply and demand. We need to thoughtfully consider how to do so in a way that is efficient, that is cost-effective, and that is fair. We need comprehensive, forward-looking plans that identify the right regional and interregional transmission projects to meet our clean energy goals. Second, as we continue to integrate more and more renewable resources, their actual value to reliability will decrease over time. For example, as more solar is added to the grid, it offsets the demand for electricity in the middle of the day and shifts the net peak load to the evening, which can cause the capacity value of solar to go down significantly. Therefore, we need to maintain our focus on accurate capacity accreditation in order to ensure resource adequacy across utility footprints, states, and RTO and ISO regions. Third, a topic that I think is particularly relevant to today's conversation and that was highlighted in Commissioner Clark's and Vincent Duane's recent white paper is how can our wholesale markets continue to work effectively in a zero marginal cost environment? For example, if we know we'll need some combination of battery storage and conventional resources to balance a grid that is becoming more and more dependent on intermittent resources, those conventional resources must, at a minimum, be able to recover their costs in our capacity, energy, and ancillary services markets. Without getting into a discussion on MOPR, or the minimum offer price rule, as more renewables penetrate our markets and are able to offer their energy and capacity at near zero prices, we need to think long and hard about how to make sure these conventional resources we need will survive. It's crucial that we don't put ourselves in a position where we are accidentally driving out competitive resources that are needed to maintain reliability. But I fear that's the direction we are heading. So I'm particularly interested in new ideas and solutions that will allow us to maintain reliability while the resource mix evolves. I'm concerned about the villainization of capacity markets when these clear and obvious trends would seem to require us to rely on capacity markets more than ever. That said, I'm glad that Chairman Glick has announced 2 technical conferences to take a deep dive into our energy and ancillary services markets, and it's a very important conversation to have. One concept I'm particularly interested in learning more about is whether at some point the cost of ancillary services needed to maintain reliability becomes more valuable than the energy product itself. And if so, how do we ensure our market prices reflect that new paradigm? To close, I've been vocal about my support for RTOs and ISOs and all the benefits they provide to consumers, in large part through the power of competitive markets. That said, I respect the authority of my state counterparts, both inside and outside the RTO and ISO regions, many of whom I spent time with this week at the NARUC Summer Conference, to choose the traditional vertically integrated utility model. I appreciate their decisions regarding the efficiencies they see gained through vertical integration, such as keeping prices stable and having more control over their resource mix. With that, I'm really interested in today's discussion, and I look forward to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Chatterjee. That was an extremely interesting summary of the central issues attendant upon the expansion of unconventional electricity generation in both the regional and U.S. grids. I think I forgot to mention during my introduction at the outset that we are taking questions from the audience. Can we put there we go. Please submit questions to kuwait.promrat@ei.org or on Twitter at that hashtag site. Let's see. We have one question from the attendees. Like any industry, builders and contractors rely on affordable and reliable energy prices. What can we do to assure or ensure that we maintain an efficient and reliable energy grid? How would you address that?
That's a great question. I think that's the core responsibility of my colleagues and I at the commission. I'm a fundamental believer that our primary obligation is to oversee the reliability of the grid. The grid must remain reliable, and it must remain affordable. Big believer in markets. I believe that our multi-decade experiment in competitive wholesale markets here in the U.S. has led to benefits for consumers in the fact that costs continue to decline, has led to benefits for the economy in that we are able to consistently deliver reliable and affordable power. And it's also led to benefits for the environment. I'm actually really proud of the fact that the U.S. power sector continues to squeeze out carbon and lower emissions while maintaining reliability and affordability. And this is happening in the absence of, some kind of legislative cap and trade. It's happening in the absence of command and control regulation. It's happening because markets and consumers are driving it, and it's something that I think we should all be proud of as Americans.
Well, let me ask one before I turn to the second question from the attendees. Let me ask a question that occurs to me, if I may. The public discussion of the expanding market shares for unconventional power, wind and solar power in particular, have tended to focus on the intermittency problem, the fact that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and the implications of those realities for the reliability of the system as a whole. What has gone, I think, Commissioner Chatterjee, less mentioned is the fact that the U.S. grid, for the most part, is an alternating current system that has to be synchronized at 60 hertz, and disequilibria in that kind of synchronization requirement can result in blackouts. And I think it is true simply from an engineering standpoint that wind and solar capacity cannot really regulate the system very well at all. And so the question then becomes, how much are we willing to pay because we will have to pay something, there are no free lunches in this world, to regulate the system so we can avoid synchronization problems and the attendant blackouts if the market shares of wind and solar power grow over time.
Yeah, it's going to require, balance and balancing resources to ensure that they are in place. Some of the issues that have arisen over the past couple of years due to extreme weather events, it's been interesting to see the challenges faced in both California's grid and in Texas's for different reasons. California, you have a progressive state with progressive policies. That grid was tested due to extreme heat and wildfires. In Texas, a conservative state with its own challenges. It was a grid designed for high heat that was tested by an unexpected cold flap. And in each instance, you saw this disequilibrium occur, quite frankly, because of myriad circumstances. In California, they had shuttered certain forms of generation, but they didn't have the balancing resources in place to be there when those resources were needed. In Texas, you had a failure across the board. And one of the frustrating things about the Texas situation is that everyone tended to view it through their own ideological lens. And so if you were anti-renewable, it was because the windmills froze up and solar didn't show up. If you're anti-thermal gas wellheads froze up. There was even a nuclear plant outside Houston that was tripped off for safety reasons. So, I say all this to say these are all complex challenges. I do believe that the business case for clean energy has been and continues to improve. and grow. And I do believe we will see an accelerated deployment of these clean energy technologies. Intermittency will continue to be an issue until we get a breakthrough in storage. I do believe that breakthrough will come. And when it does, I think it could fundamentally alter the way that Americans generate, distribute, and consume power. In the meantime, I think, natural gas has proven to be the accelerated deployment of these renewable resources. And as regulators at the federal level and the state level, we have to continue to monitor the changing patterns, the shift in our generation mix, while addressing the concerns that you accurately raise about intermittency and the potential for this disequilibrium and blackouts. And so it's something that we will constantly have to monitor. But I think the trend lines are clearly there. The costs of renewables continue to decline. I think renewables are at a point now where they can compete without subsidies and without mandates and without regulations. And as consumers, ranging from small businesses to individual families to Fortune 50 corporations, all begin to demand cleaner sources of energy, you're only going to see this trend line continue. And we just have to be vigilant to ensure that we maintain reliability and affordability.
Yeah. Let me just press you just a bit more, if I may, and then I'll turn to attendees' questions. You had mentioned California and Texas. California dealt with its recent problems in substantial part by importing power from Arizona and other states. Texas is a bit different, as you know. ERCOT is much more independent on a geographic basis. But the point is that what California can do can't be done by the entire nation. Not everyone can import. And so I'm a little dubious, Commissioner Chatterjee, that what works for one given state can work in the aggregate. And I hope you can address that briefly before we turn to other questions from our attendees.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just say point blank that there's not a one size fits all solution here. There's no question about it. The challenges that California's grid has faced and the manner in which the CPUC and CAISO have dealt with them, some of those tools aren't available in other regions of the country. Similarly, like Texas has its own unique market. Texas doesn't have a capacity market. Texas is not, interconnected. Texans value their independence. And so there's no one size fits all solution here. Some of the challenges that we see here in the mid-Atlantic, where you've got a large 13 state market where you have a wide array of state policies that are implicating market design that are unique to the mid-Atlantic. So I completely agree with your point, and that there is not a single solution for all of these market design challenges. These issues need to be addressed on a market by market basis.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Let me turn to another question from our attendees. Please have Commissioner Chatterjee talk about the Colonial Pipeline hack and threats to critical infrastructure.
Great question. And it is a sobering reality that all of us in the energy space now have to contend with. I have been saying for some time now that, and I think initially people thought I was being hyperbolic when I stated that in the 21st century, warfare has evolved to such a degree that private sector companies now find themselves on the front lines. What do I mean by that? So the ransomware attack period of time had a significant disruptive impact in the United States. Had a missile taken out the Colonial Pipeline, we very clearly would have understood that as an act of terrorism or war and would have been prepared to respond accordingly. I still don't think our mindsets are there to respond in the same way when you have this kind of cyber attack on critical infrastructure. But the reality is the economic and national security threat posed by that cyber attack is every bit as consequential as a missile attack. And we need to gird ourselves for that. I've been worried about this for some time. And I think the Colonial incident, unfortunately, brought it to the forefront for everyone. we're identifying gaps, regulatory gaps that expose our vulnerability. One thing that I've been sensitive to is that we at FERC have the authority to evaluate applications for new pipelines. We do not have the authority over that pipeline security. That authority falls to the TSA. And as recently as 2017, TSA admitted they only had 6 people responsible for the entire the security of the nation's entire pipeline network. TSA has, to their credit, stepped up and put more people and put more resources and changed their approach to pipeline security. But the Colonial incident shows you that there are still things that we can do better. There are other instances that have come up. I had a pipeline CEO tell me he was incredibly frustrated that he had been briefed by OD&I that there were vulnerabilities in his network, yet he didn't have anyone in his company that had a high enough security clearance to even be briefed on where to invest in protecting his network. And that's because this is new to us in the energy space, being dragged into the security arena in this manner. But while the Colonial attack was a ransomware attack, make no mistake, our adversaries are watching this. Our adversaries are seeing the disruptive effect it had on American life, and they're going to continue to evolve their tactics, and they're going to continue to come after this critical infrastructure. And it's incumbent upon all of us, federal policymakers and regulators, state leaders, industry leaders. We've all got to be vigilant and stay ahead of these evolving threats. This is something that sadly we're going to have to deal with for the foreseeable future.
Okay, very good. That was really quite interesting, and thank you, Commissioner Chatterjee, for your observations and your responses to these questions. Really quite interesting indeed. At this point, I think we're going to turn to our 4 panelists. I don't see any additional questions at this point from our attendees, and so I think we're going to turn to a first round of comments from our 4 panelists, beginning with Commissioner Tricia Pridemore, whose short bio I will describe in a moment. And the purpose of this round of commentary is to address issues directly or indirectly raised by Commissioner Chatterjee's observations and his responses to the questions that have been posed thus far. So our first panelist is Tricia Pridemore, a member since 2018 of the Georgia Public Service Commission. In addition to her work on electric and natural gas regulation and policy issues, she currently chairs the Telecommunications Committee and focuses on telecom matters, including issues surrounding rural broadband access. Commissioner Pridemore is a businesswoman with a background in technology consulting and workforce development. Prior to serving on the Public Service Commission, she founded the software company AccuCast with her husband. So, Commissioner Pridemore, we're looking forward to your first round of observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Syker. It's good to be with everyone today. I want to talk a little bit about state-regulated, vertically integrated utilities. They're very important to me as a Georgia Public Service Commissioner because here in Georgia, we are a vertically integrated state. They're designed to recognize energy as a necessity and not simply as a commodity because they are directly accountable to state regulators who represent our customers. That means that ensuring energy is there when it is needed most, including maintaining continuity of service during extreme events and promptly restoring service in the rare instances when it is interrupted. Vertically integrated state-regulated structures in the Southeast mean that utilities remain directly accountable to state regulators such as myself, who represent all ratepayers. This stands in stark contrast to an RTO, where the most fundamental aspects of providing energy, such as operation of the transmission system and dispatch of generation, are turned over to an entity that is not regulated by state regulators. State-regulated, vertically integrated utilities have an obligation to provide stable prices and reliable electricity because they have regulators overseeing this process. In 2020, Investor-owned utilities in much of the Southeast provided some of the most affordable prices in the nation. Further, during the last 3 years, reliability for customers in Georgia is over 99.97%. State-regulated, vertically integrated utilities are best positioned to deliver utility-scale clean energy because of the system and the framework by which they operate in. These utilities, which we oversee, are successfully promoting low and no carbon resources and transitioning their energy supply away from carbon-intensive resources. This is due to the direct role of state regulators such as myself and other policymakers, and how we frame the resource planning for the utilities under our jurisdiction. For example, while zero carbon nuclear generation is being forced into early retirement in certain RTO regions, here in Georgia, Georgia Power and 3 other partners are building the nation's first new nuclear units in more than 3 decades. In an RTO, operation of the transmission system and dispatch of the generation is turned over to a third-party RTO operator. RTOs increase bureaucracy and administrative costs paid for by customers. By layering new quasi-governmental entities on top of state-regulated utilities, it is the ratepayer that pays the most. State commissions, such as the Georgia Public Service Commission, are relegated to stakeholders in this FERC process. Mandating RTOs and disaggregation encroaches on the jurisdiction of us as regulators, who are closest to the ratepayers and best positioned to understand all of our state's resource needs. We're also best positioned to not only protect ratepayers, and in my case, voters, and ensure clean and reliable energy. Economic studies have found that full disaggregation yields no significant rate reduction. Rather, it creates volatility in electricity prices. In fact, 9 out of 10 of the states in the continental United States with the highest utility costs have fully disaggregated markets with retail choice. Customer preference, resource availability, and state clean energy guidance are the primary drivers of a region's clean energy mix, not participation in an RTO. In Georgia, as well as in states of 16 other utilities, we're looking very closely at the Southeast Energy Exchange Market. This exchange market, otherwise known as SEAM, captures the customer benefits and scale for a large energy exchange market without all of the burdens. The SEAM platform will allow utilities to buy and sell power in a way that promotes renewable energy and makes economic sense for ratepayers. SEAM builds on the existing markets in the Southeast and will create a 15-minute energy exchange market that will automatically match participants with low-cost, clean, safe, and reliable energy. Transactions will only occur when customers benefit. SEAM is expected to span across all 11 states and 2 time zones, serving over 32 million retail customers, roughly more than 50 million people. This footprint will allow participants to effectuate scale in the Southeast for the benefit of the ratepayer without the cost or bureaucracy of an RTO. SEAM is an extension of existing vertically integrated state-regulated utility structures, which means that utilities remain directly accountable to state regulators, such as myself, who represent the ratepayer. This stands in stark contrast to RTOs, where the most fundamental aspects of providing energy, which is operation of the transmission system and dispatch of the generation, are turned over to an entity that is not regulated by the state. SEAM will increase a utility's ability to see and purchase, via these 15-minute trade markers, the lowest cost energy in the SEAM footprint. Total customer benefits range from $40 to $50 million annually in the near term, and as much as $100 to $150 million annually in later years. RTOs are burdened by layers of inefficient bureaucracy and administrative costs that are ultimately paid by customers. On the other hand, SEAM's incremental startup costs are expected to be less than $5 million, while incremental ongoing costs are expected to be between $1 and $3 million annually. SEAM will further strengthen the existing market structure in the Southeast and increase competition across market participants for the benefit of the ratepayer, all while avoiding the risk, expense, and bureaucracy of an RTO. The SEAM platform increases transparency among its members by publicly publishing information about SEAM on an hourly, daily, and monthly basis. Finally, ultimately, SEAM keeps the power with the states. As a statewide elected public service commissioner, I am beholden to Georgia voters to produce reliable and affordable energy. Adding a layer of bureaucracy will only cost ratepayers more and remove their voice and constitutional authority over energy. Innovative market plans such as SEAM will allow states such as Georgia to remain able to reliably and affordably expand transmission, generation, and to integrate even more clean energy for a brighter future. I look forward to your questions today.
Well, Commissioner Pridemore, thank you very much. That was an interesting presentation, which raises a lot of questions. Let me ask one, if I may be so bold. When you say that Public Utility Commission or the traditional vertical integrated regulated utility model represents all ratepayers, that's to me a bit of a curious statement, in that surely you would agree that a regulated rate structure generates cross-subsidies across customer classes. Traditionally, peak users pay less than the cost that they impose on the system. Urban residents pay more or subsidize suburban residents. I mean, there are all kinds of standard cross-subsidy patterns that we observe and have observed for decades that tend to emerge from a regulated rate structure. You had mentioned that you represent voters. Well, voters have disparate interests, and it would be hard to believe that regulatory commissions over time are not influenced by those. And so I guess my question is, what is the basis for assuming, or is there a basis for assuming, that the cost distortions yielded by the traditional regulated utility model are less important than whatever distortions emerge from an RTO type system?
It's a great question, Mr. Zeiker. So here in Georgia, we very much so pride ourselves on our electricity rates. We currently have rates that are 15% below the national average, and they're available to customers with Georgia Power, which is our largest and fully vertically integrated utility. They're provided to customers through a variety of different programs. They can talk directly to Georgia Power to determine the rate structure that works best for them. There are a lot of programs that are out there to assist customers, never mind all of the things that have been added since the pandemic. But we also have in the state of Georgia, as most southern states do, we also have co-ops or electric membership cooperatives. For us, those co-ops, we represent the ability for them to be able to borrow. And so there's a financial element for them. And then also we have municipalities providing electric service. So you're going to get different electricity rates based upon where you live, based upon who serves you. And that all comes down to how they're able to be able to purchase electricity out in the market, whether they generate it themselves or they're purchasing it in the market or through a system such as SEAM. So I will tell you that it's history that shows that we've been able to be successful with this approach. We continue to provide some of the best service across the nation, and we're doing so still 15% below the national average.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me remind our attendees that you can submit questions to kawit.promred@ei.org or on Twitter at the hashtag that should be appearing on your screens. Let me turn now to our second panelist, Nora Mead Brownell. She is the co-founder of ESPY Energy Solutions, LLC. Prior to that, she was nominated by President George W. Bush to FERC where she served as a commissioner from the time of her confirmation in May 2001 until June 2006. Her tenure at FERC reflected her longstanding commitment to fostering competitive markets and the development of independent transmission organizations for wholesale power. As a leading advocate of responsive and effective independent board governance at RTOs and corporations, she is a strong proponent of FERC policies that promote investment in national energy infrastructure development. Before serving as a FERC commissioner, she served as a member of the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission from 1997 to 2001 and took an active role in the rollout of electric choice in Pennsylvania. So Nora, please do offer your thoughts to us at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here and glad to talk about, I think, what are really compelling economic externalities that are driving us to rethink a lot of things. But I want to revisit for a moment what we've seen in restructured markets overall and what we've seen in Pennsylvania and in the states that have gone to wholesale markets. So we've seen in the railroad industry and the pipeline industry and the telecom industry more innovation, lower production costs, more accessibility by customers to information and new technologies. We've seen increase in power plants of capacity factors and again, lower production costs. We've seen the introduction of lots of new innovations, not only in generation, but in grid technologies, and we'll talk a lot about that. So I don't want to debate the competing studies that show, but I do know that Pennsylvania, which started as a high-price state, as most restructured states did, like all those restructured states, has seen a lower increase in retail costs than structured states. But I really want to focus on what I thought we were talking about today, which is wholesale markets, which I think have brought enormous benefits, billions of dollars in both PJM and MISO and SPP, quantifiable, measurable, and have added value. But more importantly, they've added the ability to optimize existing resources while reallocating resources to where they should be and how they can offer the most to the broader economy and the broader customers. And I think it's important to remember the purpose of markets, which is to allocate risk to those which can best afford it and are best informed to take it, which is why I like a model where investors who are informed and have the capacity to make decisions that captive customers don't. So captive customers don't get an option to say, I don't really want to pay for a long-term delayed science experiment that may or may not work, particularly in areas of the country where poverty is a major issue. And I believe that what we've seen in market meltdowns in 2008 and in 2001 was investors who had been willingly taking the risks bore the cost rather than captive customers. But are RTOs working perfectly? No, they're not, because these are not static situations. The world is changing. Externalities drive change every day. And what we need to do, and I think what Neil has referenced and FERC is starting to do, is rethink what do we need the RTOs to do? How can they be more responsive to states? I think they've taken great steps forward to include the states in decision-making process. As we face this massive, massive transformation to a different generation mix, but more importantly, to a distributed generation mix, when we're confronted with extremes in weather, whether you believe in climate change or not, I happen to, because I've seen it in California. I lived it in California. I've seen it in the Northeast with the polar vortex. We need to be able to respond more efficiently. So that means changing market designs. That means changing rate designs. That means having different products and services and encouraging investments, not only in generation mixes, but in grid enhancing technologies, which, by the way, serve multiple purposes. They not only help with reliability and resilience, they help us manage asset health so we make the right investments. They give us data about where and when we need to invest in different services. Right now, we make a lot of decisions flying blind, and I'm looking forward to more data-driven decision-making with performance-based metrics. So when we invest in something and there is a commitment made by the investor, whether it's vertically integrated or not, we can say you achieved the goal and therefore you should get paid commensurate with that risk that you took. You didn't achieve the goal and therefore you will not. I think we need greater accountability regardless of the business model within the states. We need greater accountability by everyone in the marketplace. And that includes, I think, looking at some of the governance issues in RTOs. And yes, there is a cost, but I think the overall savings have been clearly demonstrated, supported by independent market monitors. And I believe that in order for us to get to a broader carbon-free economy with empowered customers, we really need to evolve. Again, we act as if these markets and customers and assets are static, and they are not. And we are missing out on enormous innovation because we have been slow to innovate and slow to really look at the risks that we can't afford to take and that we must take. And Neil talked about cybersecurity. I mean, we have climate change on one hand and we have cybersecurity on another. We have these external forces which really threaten our very economic well-being. And we need to rethink again how we look at that. And it's not a matter of whether the states are in control or the federal in control. We have a larger national economy, we have regional economies, and we have state economies. I don't think electrons know the difference. I don't think hackers care about the difference. But I do think that people who are paying the bills get an opportunity to maximize the investments that we're asking them to make as ratepayers. And I think we need to encourage as much independent investment from people who are willing to take the risk and can well afford to do so. So I really believe that markets have achieved a great deal. Do I believe that they need to achieve more? I certainly do. Again, markets evolved. The stock market, the financial markets evolved. The transportation markets evolved. The telecom market certainly has evolved and could evolve more. I mean, why this country is not in the top 10 in broadband deployment, I think, is a shocking reality that speaks to the fact that we may not have been regulating appropriately. So I'm a big proponent, but I think we need to work hard to overcome what I think are differences without a distinction and that are getting in the way of the economic development of our country. We talk a lot about the political economy, and I think that's important, but we can't let politics dominate good judgment and good economics. And I think that's what these artificial differences have a risk of us doing. So I think we need to roll up our sleeves and admit that there are places that we need to improve, admit that we need redefinitions of things like resource adequacy, introduce performance-based rates so we know we're getting what we pay for, and introduce a great deal more transparency so that we know decisions are being made based on data and not by any political or other drivers that don't add value for the consumer. Thanks.
Okay, Nora, thank you very much. Let me once again invite our attendees to send questions and commentary to the email address and or the Twitter hashtag address at the bottom of the screen. Nora, let me ask the following question. When you say we need greater accountability, I'd like you to expand on that theme in the following context, if you would. California now has not quite the highest, but the second highest power rates in the lower 48 states, just barely behind Connecticut. It is my contention that that is largely due to California's energy policies and adoption of renewables. We can leave for another day a debate about the relative cost competitiveness of wind and solar power that was mentioned by Commissioner Chatterjee. The point is that it's not quite clear what accountability is being imposed politically in places like California, in which policies yield dramatically higher power costs than otherwise might be the case. At the same time, in a partially deregulated market, an RTO or something, you had mentioned if a goal is not achieved, they ought not be compensated for it. I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's close to what you said. Well, suppose that the partial or non-achievement of whatever the goal is due to political pressures. Then how do we impose accountability? I'd like you to sort of address this accountability issue in the context of a comparative analysis of a traditional regulatory utility structure with a partially or wholly deregulated wholesale electricity market.
Sure. Well, let me make a couple of comments. California is, of course, the center of the universe in their own minds, and certainly unique in the way they have approached energy policy. I think there's a lot more in those rates than renewable energy, but I could argue that they've gone about going green in a very expensive and not particularly thoughtful way. I can give one example. PG&E was basically told to procure massive amounts of renewable power. They did so at market prices because they were under pressure, about 40% above market. During the bankruptcy, they were not allowed to restructure those contracts. Those contracts were not, by the way, with poor individual developers. They were with Berkshire Hathaway and NextEra, people who could well afford to renegotiate. And we tried, but the regulators and the governor's office did not want us to renegotiate those. Those are costs that go directly to the consumer, for which I don't think they get the value. There's also a number of public purpose programs in those rates. I hate that. I hate the hidden taxes that are both in telecom and energy rates throughout the country. I think we should know what we're paying for, and I think ratepayers deserve to know and be sure that they're getting the value. There are some metrics that would indicate many of those some of those public purpose programs don't achieve the goals that the commission set, and yet they are not allowed to reallocate the money for more purposeful ways. So I think there's a lot of reasons that prices are high in California. I think had they, for example, put out a lot more RFPs for renewable power, they probably would have gotten better pricing and maybe better outcomes. So I believe that competitive markets and competitive RFPs yield outcomes. In the wholesale markets, again, I'm not saying they're perfect. And again, I think markets have to evolve over time. I think performance-based metrics, for example, like we obviously need to reduce congestion in very specific places to reduce not only the cost of congestion, but the cost of having people stay in queues forever and ever. And I think that we ought to put some metrics in place that say, what have you done to reduce congestion? And I'm not saying we don't pay. I mean, we're obviously going to pay for prudently incurred costs, but I think we need to look much more seriously at prudency. And I think we need to have data that says that we will achieve the things we're going to achieve if we make the following investments. I'd also like to see, and I think that the FERC is working hard to do this in looking at the planning process, a lot more competitive processes to get transmission solutions that are more effective. Building big transmission, which we clearly need to do in this country, is not the only way to solve some of the local problems, particularly in some of the congestion problems. Again, it's why I believe in a lot of investment in grid enhancing technologies, which have a lower capital cost, a more immediate return, and give multiple benefits. And yet we have business models that basically the more you spend, the more you make. And that to me is a business model that no longer is relevant in today's evolving marketplace. So I think we need to look not only at business models, but I think we need to look at how we reward different business models. And I think we need to be much more performance oriented. Again, I think asking captive ratepayers to take risks on unknown technologies which are not held to a standard of timeliness or budget constraints, is really a tough one for me. And I'd like to see both the FERC at the wholesale level really begin to look at that. So open up the markets to more competitive bidding, begin to introduce performance-based rates, and there's all kinds of incentives. There's all kinds of provisions, particularly during mergers, that FERC could impose. I believe in incenting good behavior. I believe in incenting innovation. I don't believe that we should be paying people for failures of ill thought out projects. And I don't think captive ratepayers should be asked to do that as either.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you indeed. And once again, we invite our attendees to submit questions and comments at the email address and the Twitter hashtag below. Our third panelist is Ray Gifford. He is the managing partner of the Denver office of Wilkinson, Barker, Nora. He has focused his law practice on the regulation of network industries. He's a former chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, the former president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation from 2003 to 2008, and the former director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics. And so, Ray, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts today. Thank you very much. Ray, we can barely hear you. I don't know if, not really. Perhaps I didn't quite hear what you just said. Perhaps we'll go to Beth Garza and come back to you when we can solve. Beth, I hope you're ready to go out of turn here.
Absolutely. Whenever you need me, I'm waiting.
Ostensible final panelist, but in fact, our third panelist is Beth Garza, senior fellow with the R Street Institute Energy and Environmental Policy Team. Before joining R Street, she served as the director of the ERCOT, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, independent market monitor from 2014 through 19, after having served as the deputy director since 2008. In that role, she was and has been responsible for monitoring market participant activity, evaluating wholesale market operations, and recommending improvements to the wholesale market design. She has had a 35-year career in the electric utility industry, and over the course of those years has held a variety of leadership roles in generation and transmission planning, system operations, regulatory affairs, and market design for both regulated and competitive entities. So thank you, Beth, and we're looking forward to hearing your observations today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this esteemed panel. I really am honored to share the virtual stage with current and former commissioners. And I look forward to our discussion going forward. I want to talk, as someone who's been around, I feel like I've been around for a long time in a variety of roles. What wasn't in my bio is I started my career in one of those Southeast utilities, vertically integrated. That's kind of where I learned the electric utility business. I've been in Texas now for 35 years, and given our just failed response, the catastrophe that resulted in February, and the fact that I'm not a native Texan, I always approach these with certainly more in a more humble fashion than a native Texan might. We have some things that we have to deal with here in Texas, as evidenced by the catastrophe that we went through, and so. But even with that, although it's shaken mine and many of ours full faith and support for our, very competitive, focused, energy-only market. It's shaken, but not broken. And I think there are improvements to make and continuing improvements to make. And I still remain kind of firm in my belief that competitive markets are going to be the most effective way forward for end-use consumers. Nora certainly has heard her former colleague Pat Wood say this many times. Regulation on its best day is never going to be as effective as competition, and I continue to believe that. And even in the aftermath of our failure, I continue to believe that the path forward is competitive. If I had a couple of slides, and if that chart could be put up, that would be great, because I think it's helpful to. The other thing is, as I've gotten older, I look further back, and what I'm showing on the screen is just the vintage of the different types of generation that are in the current ERCOT, or the current Texas generation mix. I will say that the impetus for this graph was several years ago, when I'd seen a similar chart done for the full United States, and was wondering if the Texas picture would be different. And as it turned out, it was not. That the themes and the drivers of generation technology are not generally state specific. And the most telling thing on this chart I would point out is in Texas, you see, a switch or an investment in coal generation, solid fuel generation in the late 70s to early 80s, driven, frankly, from federal policy, because at that point we were running out of natural gas, which, we thought we had a lot of here in Texas until we didn't. And so the shift to solid fuel units, a shift to nuclear plant investments, and you see our 4 nuclear plants were some of the later installed plants in the country, finally coming online in the late 80s. Well, those kinds of investments left the then regulated entities with tremendous capital intensive investments and basically a hangover of how do I get more capital. And you see a pretty big gap between the early 90s to the turn of the century, where there was not much generation installed in Texas. And that's not because we didn't need it. The reserve margins were very tight in that 1999, 2000 time period. And there just was not the appetite by the regulated entities to make continued investments. And that you see right as a shift to opening up the wholesale markets here in Texas, opening up that to open access, non-discriminatory access to transmission systems. You see a flood of new capital coming in the way of what were the gas-fired units, efficient combined cycle units. And that was kind of the first wave of what I would say the benefits of competition, and shifting that risk of investment to generation developers who presumably were better placed to manage that risk. And we as customers in Texas have enjoyed the benefits of that type of a highly efficient resource for these last 20 years. And then as wind and the green have become, we sit on a tremendous windy asset here in Texas, and we've installed lots and lots of wind generation, and we've enabled a lot of wind generation through some previous transmission policies. To the point now, year to date, we're about 30% of the generation mix in ERCOT is from wind and solar. 30% of the electricity in ERCOT is provided from renewable sources, and what is driving that? That's not a state mandate. That's not a state requirement. Those are customers through, whether you're a retail customer who wants to buy a all green product from a competitive retail provider, whether you're a large industrial consumer or commercial consumer who wants to buy or invest in wind and solar as supply sources for your business. It is customers driving those changes, not any kind of state policy or state requirement. And that's what I think is so powerful about the Texas experience. Now, that said, as I think about, it's just helpful to remember, Texas is really, really big. Texas is a really big state with lots of people and lots of customers and lots of resources. And Commissioner Pridemore, when you talked about the RTOs is inefficient and losing access or losing accountability at the state level, I certainly understand why you would make those comments, but that was not the case here in Texas. In fact, by forming our RTO, we consolidated. We went from 10 control areas to a single control area, and that RTO is certainly under direct oversight and supervision of the Texas Public Utility Commission, who is very responsive to the state of Texas legislature. So again, I'm not sure how much of that, or I understand the difficulties of that translation to the rest of the country and the multiple state jurisdictions. But even then, I think back to 30, 40 years ago, the New England ISO or PJM, what were they at their genesis? They were, frankly, what the Southeast is talking about now. It was a group of states, a group of utilities that got together and said, we are better together. We can more efficiently share our generation resources if we jointly dispatch those. And so the East Coast was a tightly formed power pool before it was even an RTO. And it was a very simple transition for that structure to the RTOs that we see in those areas today. For other states, Southwest Power Pool, MISO, it's a harder transition because they didn't have that same kind of joint relationship and power sharing before a more structured RTO came into play. That said, I think the great enabler in all of these things and these regional sharing of electricity resources, it's transmission. Transmission is the great enabler that allows all customers to access to the lowest cost supply, and having that access to the lowest cost supply over the largest range by a transmission system that's dispatched and controlled by an independent entity, not one who has competing generation interests to protect, I think is paramount and just required to provide those benefits to end use consumers. I think, again, I'll finish up with my last thought again to highlight the, competitive forces are just tremendously powerful. And I think in terms of the, competition for, whether it's telecom services or airline deregulation or entertainment devices or entertainment access. And we as Americans, we know how to consume. We are a consumer nation. And as consumers, I think we know how to make choices. And the choice I make may look stupid to the choice my neighbor makes, but that we get to do that. And whether that's for electricity or any of these other commodities or resources we deal with in our everyday lives, we know how to consume. And so I think the challenge for regulation is to define the arena, define the boundaries in which competition should occur, and that arena evolves and continues to evolve as generation technology costs evolve, as consumer preferences evolve. And the role, as I see it, the role for regulation is the defining of that arena and allowing those competitive forces to operate within that. So with that, I'll end my remarks, and hopefully we've got Mr. Gifford back, and look forward to hearing what he has to say in the conversation we'll have later on. Thank you.
Indeed, we are looking forward to Ray's comments. Before we turn to him, though, I have a question for Beth. But before I get to that, Beth had commented that I'm paraphrasing, conditions in ERCOT differ in some fundamental way. Again, I'm paraphrasing, from those confronting regulators in Georgia. And I'm wondering, and Beth directed that observation to Tricia Pridemore. And so I think it would be appropriate to give Tricia a minute or two, or whatever she deems appropriate, to kind of respond to that observation from Beth, if you choose to do so.
Based upon Beth's comments, there seems to be a great deal of difference in just the way that the two states are structured. So here in Georgia, both policy and individual casework, including IRP approval and rate cases, that's all done at the Public Service Commission level. So we work directly with the vertically integrated utilities to ensure that they're investing appropriately in transmission and generation. We're the 5 commissioners that are telling them what the diversity mix should be. It sounds to me as if Ms. Garza has some, an overwhelming number of people calling for a particular generation means in her state. We don't have that in Georgia. What people are interested in here is an affordable, reliable product. When they flip the switch on and when they go to charge their cell phones, they want to be sure that it happens. And then at the end of the month, when they get the bill, they want to make sure that they're paying, they're getting value for that money. I think so much of it, though, comes down to the overall approach and how we look at it in Georgia. We look at energy as a necessity, not a commodity. So I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative Republican. I'm obviously a politician by being elected. And when we have these conversations with people about why this approach matters and how this regulatory approach is important, it is so that fundamentally we can keep the power on. Now, if you look at the last few years of devastating weather that has taken over in the Southeast, we had Hurricane Michael that came up through the Gulf and up through the entire center section of our state. It was over $400 million in damage. That allowed us to be able to go and allow the company to recover everything that was needed so that we could restore power as quickly as possible. And when we have not only a utility that the regulators push to, but look at in some part as a partnership where all of us are trying to provide that very best value to the ratepayer. It's a system that has worked well here ever since the electrification of the state. And for me as a regulator, I don't see these approaches coming in from Washington and other places trying to force a state that has a successful track record of doing a good job into something that just doesn't simply fit the model.
Okay. Beth, let me ask you this. You had mentioned, I think quite favorably, the statistic that if I recall, it was 30% of, is it generation or capacity in ERCOT? Generation.
Energy. 30% of energy usage through June
Has
2021.
anyone tried to think through for ERCOT what that number might be in the absence of the wind production tax credit or the solar investment tax credit and all the subventions and all the rest that we bestow upon unconventional power generation?
I'm not aware of that kind of calculation. I do think that it certainly is a contributor, and the production tax credit certainly was a contributor in the early wave of wind generation installations. An early wave is 20 years ago now. At this point, the data that I'm seeing, or what my understanding is, that without the installation costs, the levelized cost of electricity from current wind and solar, or wind for sure, I think solar, is competitive without those investments. And certainly if you're a generation developer who can within a few months or a year come to Texas, find a piece of land, connect your new facility, and start earning revenue, that's a very attractive model for many generation developers, as opposed to even a combined cycle unit that could take 2 to 3 years to build and install before you're actually receiving revenues.
Right.
So those kinds of things, I think, are drivers for some of the generation investment choices that we're seeing. And
right. There's a very substantial body of opinion, for want of a better term, to the effect that wind and solar power in particular are now cost competitive. Commissioner Chatterjee made that point. He is in a minority within that group, I think, arguing that's because they are cost competitive, there's no need anymore for the various tax credits and all the rest. Many proponents of renewable electricity do not make that leap. They argue that those generation technologies are cost competitive, but the subsidies should remain in place, presumably forever. I am deeply, deeply dubious about the cost competitiveness argument, because if you look at the EIA estimates, the Lazard estimates, many of the others, there are whole classes of costs that they exclude.
Sure.
And we don't need to get into that here, but I am really quite dubious. We can get into this later during the further panel discussion. At this point, I'd like to turn to Ray Gifford.
I am gonna get a final word on that one, though. I think those costs vary across the country, and I think that Texas has a great overlap of a really good wind resource and lots of solar, and that is unique across. I believe that to be unique across the country.
The fact that there is a powerful wind condition in the center of the country on a north-south axis doesn't tell us that much about costs. It ignores, the Betz limit, the limit on the transformation of the kinetic energy and air flows into power. I don't know that we need to get into all this. At this point, I want to turn to Ray Gifford. And if he's available, I'm not quite sure. Ray, are you with us still, or more technical problems? All right. Well, we do have, I'm going to ask the panel to respond to each other in a few minutes, but we have at least one more question now from our attendees. I'm not quite sure to whom it's directed, but the question is as follows. Changing technology, and specifically the rapidly declining cost of various forms of producing renewable energy, that's an assertion, not a parameter, and of cheaper battery storage is enabling more and more electricity consumers, especially consumers outside of urban areas, to go off the grid. To what extent is the off-the-grid option for more and more power users undermining the cross-subsidies built into the rate structures of regulated electric utilities? Might the existence of these cross-subsidies actually be incentivizing more and more electricity consumers to disconnect from the power grid. Why don't we just go in order and elicit thoughts from the three of you and Ray, if we can get him on with respect to that question. So Commissioner Pridemore, do you have a thought on this?
I actually do. So over the last 6 years, Georgia went from having very little to no solar program within our diversity mix to now we're number 7 in the nation. And we've done that through an open market approach and a bid approach to allow companies to come in and bid on one of our 9 separate solar programs. The flexibility of those programs allows and ratepayers to choose whatever type of program they want. Let's say you're a business and you want to have customer-sided solar. Let's say that you're a residential user, but you live in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association that precludes you from having panels. Well, then you purchase community solar. So we have 9 separate programs offering a breadth of solar options. And what we've done as a commission is tell Georgia Power you have to go out of the market, you have to promote these projects, you have to let them know of the availability, and then you have to report back to us on a regular basis just how subscribed they are. They've been successful. But I said all that to say that it was made possible because solar prices have went down. Battery storage prices, when we last priced them in the 2019 IRP series, they were still very expensive, especially at the utility scale model. So when the cost of batteries drops, it will make it more market affordable for us. But solar is more affordable. I actually have a longer term, probably more worrisome point of solar, which is as a country, we've seen our solar manufacturing in the United States drop to just around 10%. I just left the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and sat in on a meeting where this very thing was being discussed, where over 80% of the world's solar parts and pieces are being manufactured in China. Now, nothing wrong with imports and certainly nothing wrong with exports. But the challenge that we beget from that is if we're trying to build a cleaner environment in a cleaner world, those solar parts are being manufactured in parts of China that are 100% coal. So are we really doing what's in the best interest of bringing out a cleaner, greener future? And then what if tariffs and other outside drivers that we cannot control as easily as setting up a diversity mix, what if they come in and we start to see the price of solar go back up again? So if someone wants to go fully off the grid, it certainly with technology is possible. It's ambitious, and it's also, because of the cost of batteries right now, likely very costly.
Okay, I'll turn to Nora. Nora, do you have thoughts on this question?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start actually with a comment on the supply chain issue. I think supply chain issues have been evident during COVID in every sector of our economy, and something we have to deal with. Part of that, however, is dealing with education so that we have a trained workforce. Part of it has to do with the cost of doing business in the United States. So I agree it's an issue, and I'm glad that they were talking about it at NARUC. But it's a broader issue. It's a broader economic issue. The going off the grid movement, I don't think is as extensive as, certainly at a retail level, in most parts of the country as one might believe. But I think the question is probably more towards commercial use. And I think that is going to be a challenge because it's a pretty high risk. We have to sort out, however, if people really want to go off the grid, or if they want to go off the grid, but then depend on the grid when they need it. And in that, at that point, we do need to have realistic demand charges so that we can pay for the embedded costs of the infrastructure. But some of the proceedings I've seen have wildly inflated costs that they want to pass off to customers in those demand charges. So I think it needs to be open kimono, again, a data-driven process to determine what those are. I don't think it's cross-subsidies that are driving people off the grid. I think it's just sheer frustration with the inability to get service and the number of different kinds of products that they want. And in some cases, for some of the larger companies with really aggressive environmental goals, they really want to get green power, and it's part of their business plan. It's part of their commitment to their community. So I don't think it's cross subsidies. I could be wrong. I hadn't really looked at it from that perspective. But I think it's part of a larger issue. Are they getting what they need as customers?
Okay, Beth, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I'm going to go off in a little different tangent, which is, I think as as many parts of the country have introduced competition and open markets for the generation portion of our electricity bill, those costs have been driven down, offset by some increase in transmission necessary to bring that. Unfortunately, many of the poles and wires costs that customers, the costs they impose on the system embedded in the rates they pay for those services are continuing to be paid on a volumetric basis. And I wonder if that's going to continue to be the best way to do that. The cost of having a meter and a distribution line, connecting to your house is a pretty static cost, and doesn't really vary by volume. And so given that we have, and I think about how we pay for cell phones now, or how we pay for Netflix or entertainment. How do we do that? We pay that it's a monthly fee that we pay for access to that. And I'm of the belief that that going forward, a more rational approach to paying for those fixed investments is going to be through some sort of fixed charges to customers. Now, whether the challenge there will be, is that really a $15 Netflix kind of charge, or is that a $50 a month kind of wires charge? And that, then the affordability of that will be a challenge going forward. But that's kind of my thought on the access and customer choices and how to pay for the different kinds of services customers are getting as getting their electricity.
Okay,
and Ben,
very
good. I really agree with you on the fixed cost approach. That's I didn't put it very artfully. That's absolutely right. But to get there, we really need actual information, and not what I'd like those charges to be.
Exactly.
Okay, very good. We have another question from one of the attendees. Plus, I have a question on truth in advertising, which I'll get to later. But for now, I really want to get Ray and his views on all of this while his system seems to be working. So, Ray, let me introduce you briefly. Oh, I already have done that. Actually. That's right.
Can you hear me this time, Ben?
Yeah, we can now hear you. Ray described himself as a perennial in his private email to me as a has-been, given the number of previous positions he's had. Not nearly as many as I've had, Ray. So there we are. But why don't you go ahead and offer whatever thoughts you deem appropriate at this point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, and thanks to you, Ben, and the panelists for being patient with me. I had planned on doing this from my office as of 9:30 this morning, and then found out that my wife needed to take care of her 94-year-old mom, and I needed to drive to a baseball game in Aurora, which is part of the reason I look like I'm in the witness protection program right now.
Who's winning? Who's winning, Ray?
We're up 5-2, but it's a fraught thing for 15-year-old baseball. But again, I apologize for that, and I apologize for my technical difficulties. I think I'd start with picking up on something that actually all three, the Commissioner Pridemore and Beth and Nora both I think, made clear in their comments, which is we're not talking about a binary where we have competition on one side and regulation on the other side. We have in this world comparative differential regulatory systems. And I think that's the most fruitful way to look at them, which is there is regulation going on. There's oodles of regulation going on in the RTO world, and there are oodles of regulation going on in the vertically integrated world. It is different regulation. And notably, I think both Beth and Nora both mentioned that we need more transmission. Well, interestingly, transmission in these systems is created and comes about because of a regulatory process, namely thou shalt build, not a, hey, let's take a flyer and build a line from point A to point B. There are a few merchant lines in the country, so I shouldn't be that flippant. But I think at the outset, you need to look at these as comparative regulatory systems and ask yourself which is best suited to the ends we're seeking now. And a bit of history, and I think that's also helpful, which is the RTO model came about in the 1990s and the early 2000s to solve and to bring about marginal cost pricing discipline, right? And if you look at the politics of where RTOs emerged and where they didn't, I think there's a very keen overlay between states that A, had a bunch of out-of-the-money PURPA contracts, or B, had a bunch of out-of-the-money 1970s era nuclear units. So where you got the political pressure to restructure is you had a constituency out there who could see the marginal cost of production of power, and this is mainly the industrial customers, and could see the embedded cost of power and see an enormous delta, right? So California, Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois, places that all restructured, all had that. And so you got the political will to form these RTOs. The other thing to understand about RTOs is they're not all the same. In fact, they're very different. Beth is sitting there in Texas, which up until 3 months ago was very proud of its hyper-competitive energy-only market. They're a little more chagrined these days in Texas, and perhaps, Ben, we want to talk a little bit about that. But the point being, you've got an energy-only market in Texas. You have energy plus capacity markets in the Mid-Atlantic, New England, New York. And then you have in the Mid-Continent ISO and Southwest Power Pool, really planned utilities who are using that market, that RTO model as a surplus power trading platform, but resource adequacy and resource planning and rate-based assets still exist in most, not all the states. There are a lot of minor variations across the country, but I think the opening point still stands, which is these are two regulatory systems, and how do they compare, and why are they useful? I'll give them some credit, not all the credit, for solving and bringing some marginal cost pricing discipline into areas that had huge embedded cost problems. However, a lot of that was, and again, these are great stories. The gas dividend was realized by all the parties, all utilities across the country. The tremendous decline in renewable resource costs was realized by all the folks across the country. And if you look at, in particular, the growth of renewables, what it's doing is it's wreaking havoc with that original price, blackboard economics price system that the RTOs were founded on. And why is that? Well, they're zero marginal cost resources. And in fact, it's even worse than that. They're not just zero marginal cost resources. They're resources that enjoy tax advantages such that they're profitable at negative prices. Let me say that one more time. In the RTOs, the renewable resources are profitable at a negative price. Now, that doesn't happen in a normal market. It happens when you have a production or an investment tax credit married to a marginal cost pricing situation. What kind of pressure does that then create in those markets? And we see it, seen it in Texas, we're seeing it in PJM, which is the incentives to build capacity fall apart, because anything with fixed costs that they have to cover is not going to enter that market. And that's the problem that we're seeing, I think, in the capacity markets as well as in the energy-only market in Texas, is that the zero marginal cost resources are gradually but inexorably pushing out the fixed cost resources. And what does that mean? It means nuclear fails first, it means coal fails second, and then it means combined cycle gas fails, which is the old baseload heavier frame gas units. What that means as a practical matter is that you get capacity leaving the markets, and you have the problems that we've seen in Texas and the struggles that we're having in PJM, particularly with the nuclear units. Here's the next problem you encounter in these supposed markets, which is the political economy of them means we actually, in the end, won't believe in the price system. And the integrity of the price system is not just suspect, it's completely gone. Insofar as zero marginal cost and negative cost resources are profitable in those markets. And you then get the reaction that we've seen in Illinois, the reaction we've seen in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York, which is states step in to subsidize these units that are going to fail. And that is the ZEC process, or the zero emission credit mandates that have been imposed by states. That gets back to what Commissioner Chatterjee was not going to talk about at the beginning for very good reasons, the minimum offer price rule. So you end up in this do loop where the price distortion begets another price distortion, which begets yet another price distortion. And when your price system has no integrity, you no longer have a competitive model. You have this Franken model where everyone needs to get their subsidy for their resource or they're in big trouble. Full disclosure, I even testified in favor of some of the ZEC bills, not because I said this is great public policy, you should do it. I said this is the only thing you can do if you want to save your zero carbon nuclear resource, because it's a collective action problem across the states. So let me get to my final point, and then we can take some questions. The RTOs, as we know them, are failing in distinct ways, and they're yielding political outcomes that are not amenable and not acceptable to the political class. And so what we're doing is we're reassembling, not very well, a planning model. And the problem with network industries and this electricity markets in particular is you have to have supply and demand matched at light speed. And the additional problem we have is demand isn't very responsive to any price signal. On the margin it may be, but not in a way to significantly change the equilibrium of the market. And so where you end up back at, whether it's through an RTO stakeholder process or through a state integrated resource planning process, is some form of planning. I think different states and different regions can make different decisions on how they're going to do that planning. Out here in the Wild West, where we have a bunch of federal land and very vast spaces, the cost of an RTO has never made sense to me, at least. Nora can remember 20 years ago, we had this friendly battle about standard market design in the West. And my case at the time was very simple, and I think it largely still holds in the West, is the costs outweigh the benefits. I think there are similar issues in the Southeast. So with that, I'll shut up and thank you again for your indulgence with my technical problems. But markets, the RTO regulatory model is not the solution to a decarbonized future. And in fact, the decarbonized future is eating the RTO model.
Okay, thank you, Ray. That was really quite interesting, and just to prove that there's no order in the universe, I actually agreed with about 90% of it, which makes me worry, frankly, about myself. But there we are. We can discuss later the virtues and vices of a quote decarbonized future. I think that vision is a good deal more problematic in all kinds of dimensions than many people are willing to admit. We do have, before I turn to my truth in advertising question, there is another question that came in a few minutes ago from one of our attendees, and I'll simply read it. It mentions Beth specifically, but it's in fact addressed to everyone. Beth briefly mentioned her opening, and I hope the panel can elaborate in a fuller discussion. I'd like each panelist to talk through the system failures in Texas, recent blackouts. To what do they attribute it? And to what do they propose to remedy? Please have the panelists talk through the political and practical issues. Well, I mean, we haven't got 6 hours. That's a pretty expansive question. But let me turn to Beth first, and then observations from each of you in turn. Beth, go ahead.
I've 6 hours would be a short wrap up. It was. I would start with very extreme weather, sort of once in a generation kind of weather. Have we experienced super cold weather like that before? Yes. But you have to go back to 1989 for that kind of weather hitting as much of Texas as it did. I commented, Texas is a really big state, and all 254 counties of Texas were affected by this super cold temperatures. And before that, it was, before it got super cold, it was sort of a typical winter storm with our sleety, icy stuff that is precipitation that causes tremendous traffic and bottleneck traffic problems and bottlenecks in that way. So very extreme weather. Interestingly, as somebody who likes markets and thinks markets are really good and effective, but markets are not the solution when you are in a state of emergency. And part of the challenge that occurred during that week was what I have described as an unbridled reliance on market solutions when there really wasn't a market solution. And come, like Monday evening, Tuesday morning, we should have been more in a mode of everybody do what you can and we'll figure out the costs later. And that did not happen. And frankly, I believe my position is that has contributed to the tremendous financial overburden that we're dealing with.
Beth, you would agree, would you not, that a refusal to invest in preparation for any possible contingency, no matter how rare it is a market solution? You don't buy insurance against every possible outcome. It's too expensive.
I agree, and and part of that comes into you hear claims of, well, those power plants didn't learn their lesson from 10 years ago and they didn't winterize. I have every confidence, not that I've surveyed every power plant owner or seen a detailed report yet, but I have every confidence that generation owners did winterize their facilities, but the actions that they took were not sufficient. So,
which does not mean they were inefficient.
Well, and that's a good point. The other piece is, and I fully admit my bias as a almost 40-year veteran on the electricity side. The natural gas system contributed to this failure in a way that is not getting, from my perspective, the attention that it should get. And that will be a challenge going forward. It's the lack of symmetry in terms of natural gas providers' ability to just declare force majeure versus an electricity generators provide. They just don't get to declare force majeure, right? There's exposure there. And and whether we'll deal with those or those are kind of the issues that we're working through right now. I also think that in Texas, one of the lessons we have to learn, I'm not convinced we will, but one of the lessons we have to learn are winter emergencies are different than summer emergencies, and that it's appropriate to react and respond differently when it's freezing outside than when it's 100 degrees outside. And so I'll just stop there. I can talk for hours on that.
Tricia, do you have something to add on this question?
Well, I'm certainly not a Texan, and I appreciate everything that Beth went through in Texas. It was a scary few days to watch it as a utility regulator. I can't imagine actually living it as one. I mean, there are definitely some contrasts, and but I would only contrast them with the way that we're structured. I think the deregulated electric market, I think the solitary transmission approach of the state. I also think that it was certainly a once in a generation cold weather event, and I hope that this is an opportunity for the state to look at cold weather investments and the possibilities of it coming back. I don't know if y'all remember a few years ago where we had a snowmageddon here in Georgia. Well, since then we've had two more. So I'm here to tell you that things do return. I also believe, though, that there was a significant generation failure when you look at all of the different means of generation that didn't produce as it should have during that time. And that leads me as a regulator to always be thinking about what role does the regulator play in that process? So in a deregulated electric market, I know that the cost per watt is the most important consideration for the regulator. They're there to drive value. They're there to get the greatest return. And that leaves, where's the incentive to produce new generation? Where's the incentive to go out and do long-term planning? Where's the incentive to ensure a diverse mix? So I certainly am not going to kick Texas in the teeth. Love Texas, love to visit. But I do believe that there are differences.
Okay, Nora, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I do. First of all, I think from what I'm told, actually the asymmetry, the disconnect between the gas and electric market was literally the driving force. Arguably, planning could have been fine-tuned. Renewables outperformed any expectation and any commitment. I was talking to somebody the other day on a panel, and I said, how do you fix the gas market? Because this is not a new issue. It's been talked about at the FERC when I was there. It's been talked about forever. In Texas, he said it'll never happen politically, but the PUC should regulate both gas and electric. And I think that's probably one of the answers. But I think, again, it's really critical to get to the actual root causes as opposed to, as you said earlier, people looking at it through their own ideological lens. This is one of the problems that we have with energy markets in this country. It's too much politics and too little financial discipline and consumer focus. I read a potential consumer's bill of rights the other day, and I thought it was terrific. So I think we need to make sure we understand what actually happened, not what we want to think or who we want to blame. But I would also say there are a lot of things in Texas that have worked, in that they have a variety of products for different consumers. And by the way, Ray, I think we could price different products based on marginal cost pricing, but not all. That's part of the reform. But I will also say they've had a tremendous amount of investment in generation, in a lot of renewable, but a lot of other aspects as well. And their transmission planning process, which I don't think is impossible to be replicated on a larger basis, was very financially disciplined and was enormously successful. So they have had not interconnection, and I can't get into that Texas pride thing, but they have had a great deal of transmission built early on in anticipation of the market, which is one of the reasons the markets have worked.
Okay, Ray, do you have anything to add here?
I did a podcast a couple weeks ago with Barry Smitherman, the former chairman of the Texas PUC, for the Federalist Society, and it was a little tongue-in-cheek the way Barry said it, but it's directionally right, which is the Texas market saved consumers in Texas between 2000 and 2020 $20 billion, and we gave it back in a weekend. And I think that gets to the fundamental institutional design problem that Texas has. And it kind of gets on the heels of Nora's last comment there, which is a marginal cost energy only market is not built to sustain capacity as viable and economic in that market. And you have to come up with around market solutions to make that work. You come up with things like reliability must run cost of service contracts. You come up with winterization mandates and so on and so forth. So I do think the original problem of the Texas market is its adherence to what's fundamentally a economic model that doesn't work in a high fixed cost, low marginal cost industry. You can call it the mixing money problem. You can call it the marginal cost pricing problem, but none of that makes for incentives to build capacity, much less winterized capacity. And the other issue, and I take Nora's point, and we've been around this world long enough to know that politics and rational policy don't always mix. But in this electric world, when you're talking about, as Commissioner Pridemore said, a fundamental, vital commodity, or not a commodity, but a kind of human necessity, when you have enormous capital needs, the politics just never go away, right? And the political economy is not something you can just bemoan in electricity policy. It's something you have to plan for and design for in your institutions, because it's just going to be there no matter what you do.
I don't disagree with that, Ray. It's too tempting, but I do think that it could be a more rational discussion, and rather than politically driven as opposed to ideology, just let's look at the data, and that's all I ask for. And by the way, a capacity market would not have helped Texas in that situation. Better planning would have better coordination between the gas and electric markets. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but the reality is we all have to start planning for these extreme weather events, and nobody knows how to do that. So what was once in a lifetime is once every 5 years, and then once every 2 years. And then you look at what's happening in the West in terms of fires. It's gone from a 3-month fire season to an 8-month fire season. So we're in a different world. And my point about all of this is, rather than go back to the future and totally rely on an old business model in a world where changes are happening so quickly, let's take advantage of those changes. Let's take advantage of the technology, but let's also look for different solutions as opposed to reverting to the same. Every industry that is a surviving industry goes through these traumatic transformations. And it's hard for me, as vital to the economy and the well-being as this is, the electricity market is, then we ought to get a whole lot more serious about getting some real solutions that are going to last us for longer than 2 hours. And I admit that we need a lot of work, but again, reverting backwards just isn't going to get the job done.
Well, I agree that a capacity market would not have worked. Capacity markets are a complete disaster, as we know from PJM and New England. But planning adequate capacity, I submit, would have worked. And that, I think, is where we're headed, particularly as we head into a world with more zero marginal cost resources. You've got to plan for capacity, and you have to build capacity, because otherwise you're going to have these bad things continuing to happen.
But that's a function of market design, which we need to roll up our sleeves and do.
You say market design, I say regulatory system, Nora.
It's Okay, I read your article about they're not true markets, and I understand that. True markets, we'd rip off the Band-Aid and let people see prices. And I think that would get everybody's attention real fast. So it's a regulatory model that needs work. And I don't think reverting to an old regulatory model, because there have been so many changes in our world, I don't think that's the answer.
And
we agreed to disagree, Ray, for 40 years.
Right. And part of that, I think, is speed. One of the benefits, one of the things that markets do is they react, competitive forces react more quickly than a regulatory regime can. And I think in terms of just the transition to the retail competition here in Texas, at a time when natural gas prices were changing significantly and affecting the underlying costs of electricity, retail providers were adjusting to that much more quickly than even an annual kind of fuel reconciliation cost would, or case would have done under a regulatory regime. And that, I think, is one of those the responsiveness of competitive forces. Both good and bad, both good and bad is one of the, I say features, others might say bugs, but I think it's a feature of those competitive forces.
And the speed issue also speaks to something Neil brought up, which I don't want to lose sight of, and that's the cyber risk that we have, and where it belongs, I don't know, but you can't have it bifurcated to have gas pipelines in one place and electricity in another place and telecom in another place. Maybe it all belongs at NSA. With all respect to both FERC and TSA, I think again, we can't have a long time regulatory process to deal with cyber issues that change every minute, every second, actually, if you're in the control room. So I do want to leave us with that thought that we, in addition to all of the market challenges we have in the changing mix, cyber is probably the most critical thing we need to think about. And that keeps me up at night.
Okay.
I agree with Nora on that point, but I would say, though, that cyber cannot be the federal government's excuse to come in and take over. And I say that to say because the customer's already made an investment in cybersecurity. They've made an investment through rates that's already been secured through the recovery process. And when the companies that are being regulated do their jobs and do it well and work with federal and state partners to do so, the federal government coming in and seizing control under the guise of cybersecurity is not necessarily going to make anything more secure. What would make the system more secure would be the federal government to go after the state actors and get them. Look at the situation recently with Colonial Pipeline. We learned that those were Russian hackers. I mean, that's the role of the federal government, in my opinion.
I don't really understand what, having been involved in issues of cyber with companies, I haven't seen the federal government seize anything other than to provide data and support. So I think at the federal level, they are best equipped to actually monitor these systems. I don't think seizing control is part of their equation nor anybody else's.
I'm speaking to the new directives that are coming from the TSA that were released Tuesday.
Okay. Well, again, I think it should all be under one agency, and it should be something more sophisticated and equipped to attract the talent that you need to monitor. But that's another thought.
Okay, very good, very good. This has really been quite an interesting discussion, and I think at this point we're very close to the end of our allotted time. And so I want to thank Commissioner Chatterjee. I'm not sure if he's still with us, but if he can hear us, thank you very much indeed for your interesting and useful presentation. I want to thank each of our 4 panelists for your time and for your expertise and for your very, very interesting presentations and interactions today. Sadly, I'm not going to have time to get to my skunk at the picnic type question about the environmental problems created by wind and solar power. That'll be a discussion for another day. And I will point out that Ray Gifford claims to be at a baseball game, but we have not seen him take a bite of a hot dog. Nonetheless, he calls himself an American. I mean, there's something deeply dubious about all this. Thank you all very, very much indeed, and I hope that we can continue this discussion sometime soon. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Lots of fun.
Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.